Hi, I'm Phil Kurz, contributing editor at TVTech Magazine and TVTech.com. We're here today to take a look back at the 2024 NAB Show. I'm joined by Cy Hawkins, Director of Sales Strategy and Business Acceleration at Ross Video. Before diving in, I want to remind you that we will be taking your questions during this conversation. Feel free to submit them as they come to mind, and we'll get to them over the course of today's video. Cy, thanks for being here. Let's get started.
Yeah, no worries. Great to see you, Phil. Hope everything's all good.
Yes. So let's talk about this year's NAB show attendance for a moment. The numbers of registered attendees appear to be down by about 5,000 compared to the previous year, but up from the first year after the pandemic. The interesting thing in my mind was, according to NAB, more than 50% of attendees were first-time show visitors. What does that say about the show and the industry in general?
Yeah, I think it's always fun seeing the NAB numbers. I always you because you get a kind of vibe, when you're at the show as to how you feel it was. And I'm not surprised the numbers were down. It did feel a little quiet in some places. And I noticed that I'm sure that lots of folks on the call have seen this too. In the back of some of the halls, they had lots of tables and chairs, which was great for us all to go and sit down and have meetings and stuff. But it did mean that there were areas of the hall that used to be full that were now full of tables and chairs. So I did get that vibe that the numbers were down a bit, but they were very clever about how they organized the stands because they had a lot of big players, important players, right at the front of every hall. So it felt very busy as you walked in. Certainly where we were in South Hall, the bottom of the stairs there was a lot of people all the time, which was great. But regarding the demographic, I think it was clear that they were trying to target a slightly different group of folks this time. There were lots of sessions that were more focused around content creation and kind of post production, but not from a broadcast perspective, but more for individual users, content creators. How am I going to leverage this technology for my YouTube channel, my TikTok, and that kind of thing? And there was definitely a feeling that it was a younger crowd, and that was also shown through the keynote speakers as well. On the last day they had Casey Neistat, the YouTuber, who gave a very interesting talk. But it was I was looking down at the crowd, and it was lots of young folks who were looking to him as somebody inspirational from the content creator world, but it wasn't so much from a broadcast perspective. But yeah, interesting. There was also, I think, in those numbers was something about the international visitors being up as well, right?
So you continued to see broadcasters, though, obviously at Ross. You have
Oh, of
a lot of
course,
broadcasters. You're
yeah.
right.
Yeah, I mean, all of the key players were there, of course, and we found that, and this is ever since the pandemic, that the delegations you get from the major broadcasters are just a little bit smaller. They're still sending people, and even international European and Asian customers are coming, but they're not coming en masse. Perhaps they're sending two or three key players from their organizations come, but we're still having those important conversations with our key customers for sure. But I think the overall, perhaps the angle from NAB themselves is they're trying to target this different
Right.
demographic.
Right. Yeah, one of the biggest, the most prominent attractions at the show had to be AI and generative AI, uh, and as well as the cloud. Do you have any takeaways with regards to those?
I mean, yeah, I mean the AI thing is huge. We could probably spend an hour just talking about the implications of AI. It's as I walked around the hall, there was one section where they had a bunch of these pots, each with a different topic, and visitors were dropping ping pong balls into the pot that they thought was the most important one, and the AI one was overflowing with balls, and all the others were pretty much empty. So it was clear that that was the hot topic from the show. And yeah, there are all kinds of, from a manufacturer perspective, many of the smaller booths were AI based products of some kind or other, or leveraging AI in some way. Um, but I think the big announcement, I suppose, from the Gen AI perspective was the Adobe Sora stuff. So that's the creation of synthetic media in video now on a sort of ready to go platform that's easy to use, much like the Firefly stuff that they've been doing for still images. So I think there's all kinds of interest in that. People basically looking at the technology, looking at the demos, and thinking, how can I leverage this for my business? What does this mean for me? Because I think with the AI stuff, there really is two sides. There's the technology side, which all of us, a lot of us are technologists in this industry, and it's just interesting and exciting to see this new technology come through and ramp up so quickly. But the question remains: how can we leverage it, and what does it mean for adding value to business? And that question, I think, is still up in the air for a lot of folks. But this was a great show to come and see some of the potential of that technology.
Did you get any feel for how Gen AI might take shape when it comes to news?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult topic for news, especially. These are organizations that have built themselves on being trustworthy, and speaking the truth to their consumers. And so generative AI is a pretty scary thing, I think, when it comes to news. But there are all kinds of ways that it can be leveraged in the short term. I think there's lots of stuff around using AI algorithms for the tagging of metadata, for example. I think is very interesting in a sort of practical usage. So there were lots of folks showing how AI algorithms can be used within their MAM, or their media asset management or their production asset management tool, to be able to go back historically and tag audio, video, and text files with useful metadata. Because there's a trend that I've seen over the last couple of years, ever since the pandemic, really, and also where you have the writers' strike, last year, where there was a drop in production levels, is that people are looking for ways to monetize existing content. And so I think that's one way that AI can really be quite exciting in the short term, is organizations that hold a lot of their own content can go back through those archives, uncover media that they perhaps didn't realize they had or didn't know they could monetize, and find ways to monetize that. I suppose if you're thinking about news, they spend a lot of time and money on stock video and stock graphics that they can use in stories. Well, there's two things there. One is, yes, you can leverage AI to perhaps get quicker access to existing content that you already own. But also, could you generate a completely synthetic piece of media in the same time that it takes you to get the real one and use that on air? That's a very different question, because the answer is possibly yes. But could you do that from an ethical perspective? How does that work when it comes to, if you're a CNBC or a BBC, how much of that can you really use on your premium channels? I'm not sure, but it's an interesting question that a lot of news organizations are asking themselves right now.
So just moving away from news, but maybe related, especially when you think about the ability of broadcasters and others to start delivering more personalized news. Is there any role for Gen AI in helping to fuel like a hyper-personalized presentation for audiences? And what's the interest level among media companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of interest in that, because it's, again, if we can hyper personalize or we can target consumers directly, there's value. There's value there. And I think there are a number of different angles. Maybe for personalization or regionalization is probably the highest level one. Can we deliver our content in a local language or in a local dialect, in a manner which works for that culture? I think that's one way that we can personalize on a broader level. And then you can go down into, well, can you understand exactly who the individual consumer is at that moment in time, where they are, who they are, what their likes and dislikes are, and then manipulate advertising to get to them at the right moment to give that advert higher value. But also, from a consumer perspective, there's really cool stuff. The Weather Channel, they were just around the corner from us, and they were doing really, really cool stuff with hyper-personalized weather information through an app that would not only be able to know, as they do today, it knows where you are and it'll give you a forecast of what the weather might be like, but if it knows your diary or if it knows your habits, it might know that you like to go to the farmer's market on the weekend, and then it can tell you, well, if you want to go to the farmer's market in your location this weekend, you should go on the Sunday instead of the Saturday because the weather's going to be nicer. And all kinds of things like that, where it can get really quite granular. I think that's very, very interesting from a consumer perspective. One of the slightly more concerning, or not concerning, I don't know. It's all interesting, right? But one of the more difficult ones is I saw an application that was able to profile users based on their social media persona and all kinds of online presence. And it was actually providing a sales profile that then people could potentially use to target that user in a manner that they know is more likely to resonate with them. So the type of language they would use, all of that type of thing. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for that type of personalization in broadcast, in app-based delivery as well, where you can have a direct one-to-one connection with your consumer, and more broadly in the industry as well, like that example from a sales perspective or from an efficiency perspective.
I want to remind everyone who's watching to please submit your questions as they come to mind, and we will get to those as well. Just one more question about AI. What did you see in terms of AI being used for more traditional production tasks? One thing that comes to mind is how it can help in the development of highlight reels, for instance, for a sports presentation.
Yeah, there's some great stuff there that I think can be implemented quite quickly. Using AI to build highlight packages is a fantastic thing. I saw that on a number of manufacturer stands. Another thing is that you could actually use live transcription during a game, let's say, to produce a set of talking points for the commentators at halftime. So rather than having AI completely run your production, you can use it to augment and just enhance or speed up or create efficiencies within it. And if you think about there's more technical stuff as well that's taking advantage. So there's things like camera tracking, using AI to accurately be able to track people with robotic cameras, which is very cool. So you can minimize the amount of staff that you need for a production. And we've been in the production automation business for a very long time. And the reason we do that is because there are lots of shows, especially news and some entertainment shows, that are quite prescriptive. They follow a pretty standard path every night. And what you can do is you can build up a certain levels of automation blocks. So you can hit one button and it triggers many events to make the graphics come on at the right time, the robotic camera move to the right place, audio to come on at the right moment, for example. And that still, to build those shows, is still a manual process. And what I'm thinking that AI can come in there is that it can analyze how you've been doing those kind of shows and tweak and improve. So I think there's lots of different ways that we can use it to enhance our shows or create efficiencies without having to directly replace, humans doing those jobs. Because I always think that's always the fear. It's been the fear with automation. I'm sure we're all going through that sort of existential crisis now with AI when we're seeing how far it can go. But especially in news, where you need to have that level of oversight, you need to make sure that what you're delivering is accurate. And so there's always going to be that human element. So I think that's where AI is going to be the most useful in this kind of short to medium term, is where we can use it to augment existing processes and streamline things.
We have our first question from the audience, from Paul. He would like to know, what was the most surprising product, technology, or insight you discovered at this year's NAB show? And based on what you saw this year, what do you think we might see next year at the show?
Well, I think one thing that I saw everywhere, which I found very, very interesting, and I'm yet to fully understand the application, but it's very cool, is XR. So not XR from a virtual studios perspective, which is how I would position it, extended reality in virtual studios. Right. But I'm talking about the Apple Vision Pro goggles, which almost every stand that could find a reason to use them was using them. One that was directly related to my world in live production was there was a manufacturer showing a kind of virtualized production control room, where you put on your Vision Pro and all of the different screens and control devices were displayed for you virtually, which I'm sure has some application, but it's very, very cool. And so that was probably the most surprising one that I saw, was the use of those XR goggles everywhere. I'm still not convinced it's gonna take off. But one of the other things that I really felt going around the show this time, I managed to spend quite a lot of time walking around and looking at other manufacturers, was that it was almost a return to business as usual in a way. There was a lot of, I think there were fewer kind of net new products on show and more feature enhancements to kind of bring everybody up to speed. There was a lot of 2110, so there was a lot of IP 2110 being added to existing products and improvements of the kind of IO counts that we can get from that and the supported formats and so on. There was also more folks getting back into hardware, because I think the last kind of two NABs I would call like the cloud NABs, and every product had to be cloud enabled, and there was a huge amount of cloud stuff. But I got the feeling this time there was a sort of reality check that there's a lot of broadcasters out there across the world that still need to upgrade their studios or extend without having a major transition, which it is to go from an SDI infrastructure to a cloud one. So there, I did notice a kind of return almost to a couple of years ago, new SDI, HD SDI, UHD products coming out onto the market. And yeah, so it was AI, extended reality, and this kind of return to some broadcast hardware. Those were the big things. I think next year, the cloud production side, I know that cloud is already a pretty well established thing for playout. But I think next year we'll probably see a more defined and a more complete portfolio of products for live production in the cloud. Once we've worked through some of the current issues with latency, which is a big blocker to complete cloud workflows. And I think the one thing that I did see at the show this time, which I think is a really important component of that, is the cloud to consumer workflows. So if we want to find ourselves in a completely dematerialized future where we don't need any hardware on site, we need that full workflow, so we can go from acquisition of light and sound to the cloud, do everything we need to do up there, and then go straight to our consumers without having to come back down again. So there was lots of interesting discussions about that, and I feel like next year that's going to be the one where we're seeing all of that stuff for real with more concrete products.
We have another question from one of our viewers, Ryan, who wants to know how efficient is voice control in the control room? And he mentions that he saw a demo or a keynote addressing this during
Yes,
a
yeah,
keynote.
we did a tech demo of that at our keynote. It was our 50th anniversary this year at NAB, and so we did a little special presentation at our keynote. In fact, we had our founder John Ross come, which was very, very cool for him to be there and see what his company has grown into now. It was great. And yeah, one of the sort of nice little things that we showed during that keynote was a completely voice controlled Carbonite production switcher. And it was using a combination of different technologies to enable that, but it was using some AI to do the full voice detection and transcription, and then we're taking that transcription and converting that into actions that were triggering events on the production switcher. It was a tech demo. I think we wouldn't probably trust it live necessarily yet. The main component of that was the use of an AI large language model that had to exist in the web. So you were actually relying on a web browser connected to the internet to do that work. But if that could be offline, or you could create a transcription and a language recognition to transcription model that you could completely control and you felt was secure, then I don't think there's any reason you couldn't do it. And I think probably, again, it always comes back to a human thing as well. It's probably a realistic thing to do, but you're also relying on a human then saying the right thing at the right time. And if you've set up that kind of level of automation, if your director says something, it's going to happen, right? And so I know there's always that fear that you throw to the wrong camera. I think that would be even easier if you could just say it.
So technical directors don't have anything to worry about at the moment?
I think they're probably okay. I think they're probably okay for now. I think they're okay for now.
Okay. So you brought up IPs. I would like to pivot over to signal transport. There's so many options for facilities these days, not only SDI in the baseband world, but all manner of IP protocols and standards. Were there any developments in that area at NAB that caught your eye?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, the IP thing, because we called it a transition. We were all going to move from SDI to IP. And Ames had a vision of this completely dematerialized future with no hardware in it whatsoever. And we're realizing now, I think the practicalities of that is it's not quite that simple. There's an awful lot that needs to be done to go through that transition. But what I did see at the show was more and more products supporting 2110. Almost every product now has a 2110 option or is entirely 2110 native. And so that's good for broadcasters because it means they have choice. And I think that is the most important thing while we're in this halfway house, is that people have choice to be able to do what they want to do. And you can create a pretty reliable 2110 island should you wish to. And there are products like ones that we make that let you bridge between those two worlds so that you can create a little IP island. You can test on that and you can work with that without having to make a full transition and keep your SDI portfolio of technology working. And that's the thing. I think that moving the tech stack from an IP infrastructure to an IP one is very, very complicated. It's a very big lift, not only from a practical perspective and the technology and the associated cost, but it's a different skill set too. So whilst we are the manufacturing side, we're bringing that technology to the market. It's not always the case that every broadcaster has the necessary skill set within their engineering teams to implement that. So there's a change having to go on there as well. And I think, especially, I'm here in the UK, but I've worked in the EMEA market in the past, and it's a very different thing when you move country to country. And I think that's what helps us in a way from a manufacturer perspective. It's not like someone flipped a switch and we went from SDI to IP. If you look at markets in Eastern Europe or in Africa or in parts of Southern Europe, we're still going through an SD to HD transition in some cases, and then an HD to UHD transition yet to happen. And so I think the IP question is in the mind of anyone building a new facility, of course. But now there's even more questions like, well, maybe if we're on HD in SDI now baseband, do we want to go to IP? What's the advantages to that? Or can we start to look at purely software-based, compressed workflows? And that's why NDI is such a big deal now. Like, NDI was everywhere at the show. Everybody has an NDI product. And I think it's a great thing, actually, because we're in a kind of co-opetition mode, with NDI. Ross launched a completely NDI-based switcher this time around, and Vizartia, one of our competitors. But I think it's just great because it gives options to folks, and that's what they need right now. So yeah, I did see a lot of SDI products, as I mentioned at the start, which I think is very good because it gives hope as well to those. They're not being left behind. And I think that's one thing that we've always been really keen to do. And David's always said he wants to say yes to as many people as possible at Ross. And I think that's really, really important. If I was on the buying side, I certainly wouldn't want to feel like I was being forced, into changing, making a massive tech stack change. But of course, those products are there, and I think they're pretty well established now. So if people do want to go IP, and we found it certainly in the main markets in Western Europe, in North America, if there are big facilities being built or distributed facilities, it's pretty much going to be 2110 in those environments. But that's just not the case for everybody. So I think it's very cool that there are options for folks.
So again, shifting gears, over-the-air broadcasters saw many developments in the world of ATSC3. What were your impressions?
Yeah, I think it's a long tail, right, on the ATS3 donkey, I guess, right? It's taken a long time to come to fruition, but the potential there is so good. And I think in the US market, they need that kind of step up in quality. That's what they're looking for, a big step up in quality they can get to consumers with something new and different to what they've had for a long time. And Sinclair, they're pushing the Peak 3, and I think there's lots of great opportunities with Peak 3 and with broadspan and the other ways they're trying to get this data casting sorted, that they're going to be able to roll out to more and more regions. I know that there's a few regions now that have had full rollout, but it's still quite we're still slow to get off the ground with it. But the technology is there, I think, now, and it's the adoption and the rollout of that. And then, of course, you need to roll out the technology to the consumer as well. So it's a slower process, and it's not being mandated, right? So it is going to take some time to get through it. But I think one of the things that I saw at the show on Next Gen TV was really about, well, two things. One is HDR. I think it's going to be a very cool way to give people a higher quality viewing experience at home without a major lift and shift of tech stacks that are back in the broadcasters. So we can enable HDR fairly easily and get that out to customers. But also it's the feedback loop that you're going to get from ATSC3 as well. So when, to get back to your hyper personalization stuff, if we can understand who our viewers are and what they're watching and when, it gives the ability to have a much closer relationship with the consumer. And so I think that's what ATSC3 is going to bring as well. It's the quality and it's the connection with the consumer. So yeah, interesting stuff. And I'm sure that next year that adoption will be much, much higher, and there'll be more stations rolled out by the time we get around to NAB 25.
And if I can put in a shameless plug, if you are interested in data casting via 3.0, be sure to keep an eye out. Next week, I will have a extensive coverage of OTA wireless on TVTech.com. So just want to let you know that. Well, okay, so we talked about 3.0. What about 5G and 5G broadcast?
Oh, I'm very excited about 5G. I think of all of the technologies, I think 5G could be the most transformative one, because a lot of the other stuff that we're talking about at the moment is kind of transport, right? We're moving video around in different ways and we're processing in different ways. But at the end of the day, it's about making television, and you need acquisition of light and sound in a place, and then you need talent talking about that event, right? That's basically what we have in TV. And so how can we shorten and simplify the tech stack as much as possible to enable the creation of more television faster and to a higher quality? Well, I think 5G could be a major enabler for that, because if we can create a private 5G splice network in a location for a period of time, it's going to be cheaper than leasing fiber. It's going to be cheaper than rolling huge amounts of trucks out to locations or having to buy public internet bandwidth. But at the same time, it's the simplicity that I think is really exciting. I saw all kinds of 5G modules that are going to be able to take light and sound from cameras and microphones directly up into the cloud, ready to be processed. And so that's the shortcut that I can see to getting us into this dematerialized world. And I heard, I think it's one of our friends from SVT in Sweden, who's always pushing the boundaries, saying that he could see a vision where his organization would only have a 5G network. So even in the main offices, they wouldn't have a network or wireless APs or anything. They would have everybody with a 5G SIM that's connected to their private secure network. And then journalists, they could be in the field or in the office and they'd already be on that same network. And if you level that up when they're filming a 25 camera football game, perhaps that could be done in the same way, with every camera with a 5G connection that goes back up into their private cloud, ready for processing by a distributed team of workers who could be editing, doing replay, mixing the show, doing audio from their homes, if they wanted to do it that way. So I think that 5G future is very exciting. And I did hear that France Television and NBC Universal Peacock will be doing some very cool stuff with 5G for the Olympics. And I think a lot of this cool tech will come to the fore during the Olympics, where they're going to be filming more hours than ever of Olympic sporting content and rolling that around quickly to generate all kinds of post-produced content based on that as well. It's going to be very exciting and filmed in ways that they couldn't film before. I think because we have surfing this time, I think I even saw they're going to have 5G connected cameras on the water coming back on 5G, which is pretty cool. I think there's great use of that technology, and it's pretty exciting stuff.
Well, that gets right to the heart of media workflows and the transition from a kind of a hardware base to up into the cloud. Were there any other noteworthy developments at the show with regard to media workflows that caught your eye?
Yeah, I think moving moving more and more of those workflows to the cloud is very interesting. I think I saw again some of the camera to cloud stuff that Adobe are doing with Frame.io is really very, very cool. And now they have video for that same thing, so we're able to get rushes. If you're talking about post-produced content, you can get rushes up into the cloud almost instantly for review. That's very, very exciting. On the MAM side, I think there's all kinds of very cool stuff that we can do with AI that I touched on earlier, digging into existing archives, understanding our content better than ever before, tagging that content in ways that we've not been able to do before, and also being able to search in new ways. So using real language to ask for a certain type of clip. You can even ask for a certain type of clip with a mood, and it will be able to analyze the content and tell you, is it a happy speech, or is it a sad speech, or what was the weather like in the background of that shot? Like all kinds of cool stuff like that, that we can leverage the cloud for and leverage AI to improve speeds and improve access for those things. I think the distributed workflow stuff as well, like in live production, we've been doing Remy for a very, very long time, but I think what we're talking about now is a slightly different thing, where if you can bring the latency down enough or have clever ways to move live video around up and down from the cloud, you can give people complete freedom to work wherever they need to work. You can have a workforce that's made up of the most talented people that you have, regardless of where they happen to be at the moment you are making that show, and get your content to them at a very low latency, allow them to work. So I think that kind of stuff is really, really cool. And that technology is now here and working. And so I think those kind of live video workflows are top of mind for a lot of broadcasters.
When you bring that up, that makes me think that the broadcasters, OB companies, will be able to reduce the resources that they have to send to a venue, maybe eliminate them entirely. I guess that would be perhaps a goal in the future. That must speak to the whole push for sustainability internationally, and I know that in the U.S. it's probably going to be coming on. What are your thoughts about the sustainability and what we saw at the show?
Yeah, so if I get on my soapbox for for a second, I always find the trade shows are really it's a very wasteful event, right? If you're looking at it from a sustainability angle, it's not a great showcase for what we're trying to do in the industry. So it always feels a little bit two-faced, because we're at this very, very wasteful event trying to talk about sustainability. But I think it is good that it's on the agenda. We received 2 awards this year, one for our Ultrix platform, which is, we call it a hyper-converged platform because we put a bunch of stuff into a single box, which means you can reduce power and weight and cooling necessary for those productions. So like you say, we could roll out a much smaller truck to a location. And if you go into that future with the 5G scenario that I said, you could reduce it even further, So I think it is on folks' minds. I think the driver that will help, like if you have a vested interest, like I think most of us should do, in trying to reduce our carbon footprint, that it's an interesting thing that it's also valuable to broadcasters and production companies that they can reduce cost. So I think if they can reduce cost, that's going to help drive the adoption without it having to all be about sustainability. The sustainability angle on its own probably isn't enough to motivate people to make those changes. But if they can save money at the same time, then I think that's very, very cool. Because I think it's important that we don't just pay lip service to it and use it as a business driver, but that we all actually do care, and we're making best efforts to try and reduce that carbon emission wherever we can. So I think there are technologies out there that can massively reduce the footprint for rolling trucks to locations, reduce that weight, power consumption, cooling, etc. And the push to the cloud will take that the next step. But you will still always need to have boots on the ground. We're still going to need talented camera folks in the stadium to be able to film those shows, get the great shots that we see today. And I'm sure that we're not going to sacrifice that. But I think shortening the chain behind that and getting as quickly as we can from there to a distributed production workforce and then out to consumers, that's where the gravy is, really.
So we have another question from Paul, and You may not know the answer to this because it involves two companies that are not Ross, but here we go. Does AWS's new monetization solutions announced at this year's NAB show bring them any closer to Google's deep ad tech and monetization solutions?
I'm afraid
And
that isn't an area of my
yeah, that's
expertise,
okay.
but
That's fine. Just thought we'd check.
it's a
Okay,
great
no
question,
problem.
I'm sure. But I do think that there is, if we're talking from our side, when you look at these cloud-based solutions that do tend to rely on AWS or Google Cloud or Azure, or any of these folks, we are still at a point where I'm not sure everybody quite understands the impact of the costs on those things. So we're in a learning phase from the technology and how can we actually make it work. But at the same time, there are costs associated with that not everybody is fully aware of yet. So you've got your ingress and egress costs and the processing costs that you have on top of that too. And so I think there's I heard some folks talking at the show about how they were testing out a cloud-based multi-viewer, and they'd left it in the studio, and the engineer left it on for like 2 weeks, and then they had a huge AWS bill at the end of that time because they hadn't realized they needed to turn it off. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff around how we price and how folks deal with those costs. But yeah, I'm sure AWS and all those folks are leveraging everything they possibly can to monetize at every level.
Let's get back to the real world and out of the cloud for a moment. 4K was prominent at the show. Was there anything in regard to 4K that stood out for you? And what about 8K?
Yeah, I remember when I first started coming to trade shows in the early 2000s, it was always the most exciting thing was going to the NHK booth and seeing what kind of crazy high resolution technology they had. And that NHK are still the ones pushing, and of all the 8K, I think the only 8K broadcast channel is going to be released NHK this year. And there's a desire for the adoption of high resolution screens. I saw a conference not that long ago with representatives from Samsung who were saying that consumers should be buying a new television every year. I just don't think that's realistic. I can't imagine most consumers wanting to buy a new television every year. And I think the kind of slowdown that we've seen in adoption of high resolutions is down to the fact that they're kind of happy. I think consumers have reached that point where the perceived quality is good enough at UHD. It's good enough in HD for some folks that we have seen that slowdown in adoption, and it's harder for the TV manufacturers to sell those new resolution. That's why I think there's a higher interest in things like HDR and better wide color gamut technologies that help improve the experience without having to expand your screen size, to something unrealistic. So, but there were a number of 8K ready products out there. So it is the industry is slowly twisting towards it, but you can see now that UHD is a pretty standard thing, and that 12G, we've been using 12G for years in our products, and a lot of our customers aren't utilizing all that bandwidth, but we're using those chipsets to allow IO in 12G. But now that's pretty much standard everywhere, and I think if I was on the buying side, I'd expect to be able to buy UHD 12G ready products, even if I wasn't intending to use that and I was just going to be sticking at 3G for now. But yeah, I do think it's going to be a hard sell, the 8K thing. I'm sure that from a manufacturer perspective, we would love it because we can upgrade our customers from UHD to 8K. But I'm just not sure. I think the blocker from that at this time is going to be the consumer desire. I just don't think there's going to be the demand for the upgrade that we did have for HD and UHD.
So you've brought up high dynamic range a few times, and we talked about ATSC3, for instance. One of the things that stood out for me was at the ATSC booth, they were talking about a local television station in Louisville, WAVE, putting the Kentucky Derby, which was going to be a few weeks
Yeah.
after the show, just last week, on the air in HDR via Next Gen TV. I was just wondering, was there any other HDR milestone or something that caught your eye as it relates to high dynamic range?
No, I think that was the most interesting one that I saw, because it was it was a real life application that was going to happen right after the show as well, which was pretty cool. So I think it's something that's going to be rolling out everywhere. We obviously, I think there's a drive from the consumer for that because of Netflix and other streaming platforms where people can see, oh, I'm getting Dolby Vision or I'm getting HDR10, and so I think that's a really good way to push a consumer benefit through the technology that I think we're going to struggle with on the 8K side. So yeah, I did notice that there were more and more products as well supporting HDR, and that's becoming the HDR workflows, and certainly like where you've got to do translation between the different formats. That was a very bespoke thing a couple of years ago, and you needed dedicated technology to do that. And what I did see at the show was that that is now being baked into a lot more products. So we're seeing lots of products supporting multiple HDR formats and lots of products supporting the transition between them. So it's making your productions a little bit easier. You can come in with a production switcher, drop it down. You know it's going to support the 3 or 4 different formats that could potentially come up. And allow you to switch between them. So I think we're at a point now where it's becoming a pretty standard requirement, and so the technology has obviously followed that, and we're pretty much good to go from HDR.
Have you seen also in that line the ability to convert between SDR and HDR and vice versa being built into more products because obviously broadcasters have to serve both audiences?
Yeah, I think that is really important because you don't want to be switching between the two. So it can be quite a jarring experience for the consumer if you're switching between SDR and HDR between 2 back-to-back shots. So yeah, we've been doing that in our products for a while, and I know that there's a lot of manufacturers that are doing the same. So giving customers the ability to play in whatever, color space that they want to play in, and being able to convert between the two is very, very important. And I get the feeling that there's a desire, certainly in the emerging markets, there's almost a desire to move to HDR before moving to 12G, because I think they can see the value there more than they can see the resolution value, just because of the perceived quality to consumers.
So, Sai, I can't let you go without asking you about one of Ross's new products, and that's the Artimo trackless camera robotic system. Could you tell us about it a little bit?
Yeah, I wasn't intending to come on here and plug too many Ross products, but we did release a pretty incredible new robotic camera solution at the trade show called Artimo, which is a shortening of art in motion. Which is a beautiful name for a beautiful product. It's a free roaming camera robotic system that can do both the kind of breathtaking beauty shots that you would get from like a tracked robot. So there's beautiful, smooth panning and dollying shots, but it can also carry a complete payload. So you can have a large prompter on there, talent monitor, and all that kind of stuff. And it can also go extremely high, so you can get kind of dolly-like shots with panning and motion as well. It's a very, very cool thing, and it also the product itself looks beautiful. So I highly recommend people to click on the link down in the handout section, go on the Ross website and take a look. And I'm sure that we'll be seeing these featured, just like we've had robots featured on the BBC News for many years. I think we'll have these featured in shot in productions, just because it looks like such a cool high-tech piece of technology. It's great.
Well, that's all we have time for today. A quick reminder, you can stay up to date with industry trends by reading TVTech and TVTech.com, where you'll find my articles and columns and those of all my colleagues. But before we go, I want to thank Cy Hawkins for taking out time to be here, and a special thanks to all of you for watching and all of your questions. See you next time around.
Thanks all.